Hello everyone, welcome to this session on .NET interview questions. .NET is a framework which is developed by Microsoft, which is basically used on top of C# programming language. And in today's session, we will be talking about questions which will basically help you to crack interviews which are related to .NET developers. So let's go ahead and get started. But before we move on, guys, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Intellipaat channel and also click on that bell icon to never miss out on any updates from us. So now let's go ahead and get started with the agenda. Alright guys, so first we'll discuss some questions about the .NET architecture and then move on to discuss about managed and unmanaged code questions. Once we're done with that, we'll talk about constructor types in .NET and then move on to discuss about manifest and metadata questions in .NET. Finally, we'll take up questions about MVC framework, data status checks, and security controls in .NET, and then we'll conclude this session. So guys, this is the agenda for this session. I hope it's clear to you. Now let's move on and talk about some questions related to the .NET architecture.
So let's begin with the first question on the top .NET interview questions, which is of course the very important question that you might be asked as soon as you face the interviewer. It's what is .NET framework? Well, you can answer this in a very concise way as shown on your screen. It's one of the platforms which is actually provided by Microsoft. It wasn't open source before, but then they made it open source. So why is .NET framework used? Well, it's used to build a lot of applications that are supposed to be used, on Windows. But the main advantage here is that you can work with a couple of programming languages of your choice from C#. There's VB, there's Basic, there's Perl. There's so many languages here that you can work with when you use this framework in a way where it will not add any sort of native dependency to the system that you're working on. For example, you can sit on a Linux machine and still make use of the .NET framework, as all the code gets converted into something called as intermediate code, and so this intermediate code gets converted into the actual machine code that will be read and understood by the machine. So one very important thing to talk about the .NET framework is how the object-oriented model is used here, because all of the programming languages here, and mostly when you're generally working with the .NET framework, the entirety of the object-oriented model, the paradigm, can be seen here. With this, we can come to the second question that states, what are some of the common components of .NET? There are many components that you can actually state for this question. In fact, there's lots and lots. I can fill up this entire screen and I would still not be done with it. But then it's very important that you mention the top 3 or top 5, and that's what I've put up on the screen right now. We have the .NET class library, we have the .NET framework, of course. We have something called as the language runtime, application domain, and profiling. These form to be some of the very vital components that form to be a very important part of the .NET framework. With this, we can come to question number 3, which states, what does JIT stand for in .NET? JIT, you might have heard of. It's something called as the just-in-time compiler. So what it does is it takes the intermediate code which is outputted after you have executed the programming language, and then it helps convert this code into native code very, very easily. It does not take much effort, as it's independent of the local operating systems, the local runtimes, the local frameworks that it is attached to in your computer as well. So when we talk about execution generally in terms of .NET, right, the code gets converted into the native language, what we call as bytecode, and then the bytecode is actually processed by the CPU, and the framework will help to make sure that the CPU and all of the other devices in the chain understand this particular code. So to do this, we need a compiler, and this compiler is JIT. So with this, we can check out question number 4. Question number 4 states, what is MSIL? Well, MSIL, or IL as it's mostly called, is short for Microsoft's intermediate language. So this intermediate language that we've been talking about for a while actually is a set of instructions per se, because these instructions are required for a variety of operations such as memory handling, for example, even exception handling, and a lot of other tasks. It will provide a very good, clear, concise set of instructions on how to store values, how to use values, and eventually even the same for methods as well. So all in all, MSIL is actually a very, very important, I can say that it's a key part of the Microsoft .NET framework. With this, we can come to question number 5, which says, what is CTS? Well, the next 2 or 3 questions are very, very important, so please do concentrate. So CTS is actually a short form for Common Type System. So what CTS actually is, in a very simplistic way, is nothing but a set of rules that are used to govern what the data types are. See, for example, we have integer data type, right? So integer data type will not contain the floating value, and then floating values also have a range. If it's a double, then even that value will have a maximum minimum range. So all of these rules that we attach to data types are actually given by the CTS. So it will describe all of the data type that you've been using to build your application, and eventually tell you if there is something out of bounds, or if you have missed something out. So it would not make sense if you have 2 string variables and if you try to add them and expect a mathematical output, right? So all of these rules are governed by the CTS, and CTS is common throughout. As I just mentioned, the .NET framework supports a variety of languages, and for that, the CTS actually applies to all of these languages where it's mostly common. Hence the name Common Type System. Next, we're going to check out another common entity, and this one's called as CLS. CLS actually stands for Common Language Specification in .NET. It's a bit different to CTS. And what is CLS at the end of the day, if you have to answer it in a very concise way, is that it is a common set of rules followed in the .NET framework where, it'll allow you the capability to work with multiple languages at the same time. What we call as interlanguage operations, or interlanguage compatibility as well. Or in fact, it's also called as cross compatibility if you're aware of the term. So to make sure that multiple languages can be used in the development of an application, and this cross language compatibility can apply throughout the entire application that you're developing in the .NET framework, we have something called as the Common Language Specification that makes way for the ability to have these interlanguage operations. Well, with this, there's another important question. Again, the C here stands for common as well. So what does CLR stand for? CLR actually stands for Common Language Runtime, and this is, again, if I have to pick from all of the 3 things that we discussed, CLR forms to be one of the most important components of .NET. It is like a foundation. It gives you the scaffolding on which a lot of applications are built and run in the .NET framework. So to give you an example, let's say there's a user who writes an application in the language of C#. Then of course, as soon as it gets compiled, we have the JIT, and then it's converted into the intermediate code. Until here, we do not have the CLR interpretations, and after this is when CLR comes through. So it takes up this intermediate code and it makes sure that all of the things are fallen into place. So what are these things that CLR takes care of? If you're asking, it's memory management, it's security protocols, there's libraries for loading, what libraries have to be loaded, and if it's a multi-threading environment, then of course you have to check out about thread management as well. So all of these form to be, these 4 especially are very vital after your code gets converted into intermediate code, and you have to work with the code. When that's the particular case, then CLR plays an extremely vital role among all of these 3 common entities that we discussed. With this, we can check out the 8th question that states, what is the difference between managed code and unmanaged code? This is a pretty simple question, but then it would always add value if you add 2 more points instead of just the primary point. So the main answer that you can say is, hey, managed code, this is the code which is completely managed by the runtime. The runtime has authority over this code, and unmanaged code, of course, is not being managed by any entity. Do not stop at this, because there are many more points where you can show the interviewer that you know the topic clearly. See, for example, in managed code, right? So garbage collection is a part of managing the memory. So destruction of variables which are not using to clear existing memory, that's garbage collection. And then when we talk about unmanaged code, so for memory management, we do not have garbage collection, but we have the entire runtime environment, and that itself takes care of the management. And if we talk about one very, very important difference here that you should mention, it's the 3rd one. It says the .NET framework is necessary for execution whenever you have managed code, because you have an entity managing the code, right? So without which it wouldn't make sense. With unmanaged cores, of course, it does not depend on any sort of .NET framework to run because it's not being managed or looked over or having an authoritarian entity on the top of it guiding it or anything like that, right? So these 3 points found to be very vital differences between managed code and unmanaged code. Now, if we talk about the next question, it talks about how managed code actually executes in the .NET framework environment. And if you're wondering about how to execute managed code, then it's pretty simple. It's about 4 steps. I've mentioned it in the order on the screen right now. So the first step will involve you choosing a compiler that can execute the code. If you've written your program in a C#, in the C# language, you will of course require a C# compiler. And after your code gets compiled, this post-compilation piece of code gets converted into what we call as the MSIL or the IL intermediate language, or the Microsoft intermediate language, right? And this is done using a compiler. What is this compiler? It's called JIT. We already discussed this. And then, of course, what happens after this is CLR takes over. The intermediate language gets pushed into the CLR, which converts it into the native code using our just-in-time compiler, of course. And lastly, this native code can now be run on the .NET framework, and these 4 steps are very, very vital to make sure that your managed code executes flawlessly in the .NET environment. With this, we can come to the 10th question that states, what is the meaning of state management in .NET? Well, state management, it's very clear with the name that it is used to manage something, right? So it is an entity that monitors and maintains all the states of all of the objects in the runtime. Since we spoke about how object-oriented paradigm is a very important part of it, even when you think about it, a web page or a web controller can also be considered as an object as well. So to manage all of these objects, we have this entity which monitors it, and that is called as state management. And of course, there are actually 2 types of state management that are very important. One is the client-side management and the other one is the server-side management. Client-side management, as the name suggests, will store all of the information on the client machine itself, and it is mostly, comprised of simple objects, or let's say reusable objects as well. It's a little different on the server side, and here again, as the name suggests, the data is stored on the server, and at the end of the day, what we're trying to make sure here is that we're trying to preserve all the information of the server on the server itself, and on the best methodologies on how you can manage and maintain all of these information. So this is the subtle difference that lies in between the client-side state management and the server-side state management in the .NET framework. So now, we can come to the 11th question. The 11th question states, what is the difference between an object and a class in .NET? See, when you think about it, again, as I'm reiterating on the object-oriented nature, everything is an object in the world of OOP. But then there's subtle differences between objects and a class, as you'll see on the screen. What an object is actually one particular instance of a class. And what is a class? A class is basically defining what the object is and instantiating that, then it becomes an object, right? So, class will give you the basic scaffolding or the basic foundation of what an object is supposed to be like. And then the object itself will then morph from a class after it has been instantiated. So first we have the definition of an object, which is defined as class, and after the definition, once we go about instantiating it and giving it some meaning, then it becomes an object. And of course, objects are used to access properties from a class, while the class itself are the description of all of the methods and the properties that get attached to every single object in the particular discussion. So this is the very simple difference that lies in between an object and a class in the .NET framework. Then we have another very small difference with the 12th question. It says, what is the difference between system.StringBuilder and system.string in .NET? Well, these are 2 subtle string operations that are very much used by most of the .NET developers out there. So understanding the difference is very vital. So with StringBuilder, what you can do is the data is actually mutable. So after compilation, you can work with the data, and the data is actually changeable as well. But then when we use system.string, the data is immutable. That means the data cannot be changed. And sometimes when you're working with strings, it becomes very important that you attach data one after the other, or one data to the end of the other. And this operation, what we call as append, is supported by StringBuilder, while system.string does not support the use of the append keyword. So you cannot have two strings merging when you make use of system.string, but then it is possible when you make use of StringBuilder, guys. So this is, and again, as I just mentioned, is a very subtle difference between these two operations when we talk about strings in the .NET framework. Now, coming to the 13th question, there are a lot of abbreviations in .NET, as you can see, and here's another one. It's called as LINQ or LINQ. So what is LINQ? LINQ is basically the abbreviated form of what we call as the language integrated query. And when you think about it, it's not a new thing. It's about 12 years old. It came out in 2008, and what it does is it provides users with these extra set of features that make sure that when you work with the .NET framework, things go easy, things go smooth, and that you can do a lot. You can have a lot of output by putting in a little amount of effort. So that is the main use of the language integrated query system out here. One thing to talk about LINQ that you are supposed to say to the interviewer is that it will make sure and it will provide the users with the ability to work with the data, change the data as and when required, and make sure that there is no dependency or there is no tie to the data source. This is a little bit of isolation that LINQ brings, and it is very, very vital, because if there are certain dependencies and these dependencies can cause a lot of problem as well. So for that, LINQ is very vital. Now, with this, we can move on to the 14th question that states, what is an assembly in .NET? What is an assembly? When you think about the literal term, an assembly is a collection, right? So it's mostly a collection of people. In .NET, it's similar as well. So assembly is actually a collection of all of the logical units that are used and work within the .NET framework. Now, with that, you'll have a question saying, what are logical units? Well, logical units are these very, very important entities that are actually required. They form a very key role in building applications, and later we have an activity called as deploying an application. So building application is one phase of making use of the .NET framework, while deploying it for active usage is another. So logical units are required to do all of these. So logical entities can be a collection of executable files, it can be a collection of DLL files, and much more. So with this, we can check out the 15th question. The 15th question states, what are some of the components of an assembly in .NET? When you ask this question, again, as I've mentioned, we discussed the components of .NET, but then here are the components of an assembly. There are 4 very, very important components that you're not supposed to miss. So make sure to take a note of this. The 4 very important components are resource, the intermediate language code, the metadata, and the manifest. Resource, of course, talks about all of the files that are required to build the application, and MSIL deals with the intermediate language code that we previously discussed. And then we have metadata. So metadata is data that describes the data itself. So if that seems convoluted, think about having a certain piece of data and you have another file which further describes what is happening with your original data. So that's metadata in a very simple way. And then we have manifest. Manifest is where there's a lot of information regarding the assembly itself. So we're talking about the components of an assembly, right? So manifest is again a very, very important file, a very important component of the assembly, as it contains a lot of information about the assembly itself. So these 4 are some of the very important components of an assembly when you talk about .NET. Now, coming to the 16th question, it states, what is the meaning of caching? I'm sure you've heard of the term cache before, right? So it's a term which is very frequently used, and the meaning is, again, you might already know it. So it's a term where whenever we have to talk about storing a piece of data temporarily so that it can be accessed quicker, this exactly is what caching is. I'm sure you're already aware that the read-write speeds of your random access memory or RAM is exponentially faster than what is the read-write speed of a hard disk. So what we try to do is we take certain amount of data and we store it temporarily in this smaller, tinier entity called as RAM, where we have faster access to it rather than checking it on a conventional hard drive. And since this is making it fast, the goal is that we're trying to speed up the entire execution, and we are speeding it up at a very, very rapid pace, and this in terms of performance is mostly unbeatable. Now, if you're wondering about why not move all of the data to a faster entity, well, in that case, we already know that there are certain limitations of making use of RAM, and you can have a maximum of say 64 GB, 128 GB of RAM, but then if your data is a lot more than that, then it does not make sense to do that. And of course, random access memory does not come cheap as well. Anyway, there are three types of caching that you're supposed to know about. One is the data caching, we have the fragment caching, and we have the page caching as well. Guys, it's called caching or caching as well. So in case if you're asked about caching, well, it's pretty much the same meaning as cache as well. These are two pronunciations and both mean the same thing. Moving on to the 17th question, it says, what is the difference between a function and a stored procedure? Well, this is a very interesting one because the difference is very simple, but it is very vital that you state all the points. So a function has the ability in .NET to give you only one value. So it can have only one return value, while a stored procedure is an entity that can return any number of values that is required. This is the first most important point. And then when we talk about functions, there is no support for the usage of exceptional handling. So exception handling, what we do is we make use of try blocks and catch blocks, and then try to see if we can find any exceptions, catch it, and then resolve it. But this is not supported in functions, while it is supported in stored procedures. And when we talk about inputs that can be passed to the function as well, the arguments that that make up the input part of it can only have one input parameter in the case of a function, while for a stored procedure we can actually declare what the input parameters are and what the output parameters are required as well. And that is very important. Now, when we talk about the last point, a function can be called from a stored procedure, while the reverse is not possible. You cannot call a stored procedure from a function. So remember this very important point. A function can be called from a stored procedure, while a stored procedure cannot be called from a function. So make sure to mention all of these points when asked. Well, with this we can come to the 18th question that states, what are the different constructor types that are present in C#.NET? Again, you do not have to explain all of these types to a very detailed explanation, but then make sure to not miss the types when when stating it out. So there are 5 main types of constructor classes when we talk about C#.NET, and they are the copy constructor, the default constructor, we have something called as the parameterized constructor, we have the private constructor, and we have the static constructor as well. So make sure to mention what the constructor types are. Then of course, if you are asked to explain any one of these, then you can just state a statement or two where you indicate about what each of these constructors are. So with this we can come to the 19th question that states, what are some of the advantages of making use of a session? Now, again, there are so many advantages whenever you make use of a session in .NET, but then let me give you the top 4 or the top 5 advantages, the most advantageous things of making use of a session. The first thing is that a session can hold all of the user data which can be used throughout the application, right? So you can be using multiple languages to code your applications, and then data can be shared, stored very easily by making use of a session. And then the second point is that it is very easy to implement and store and work with, in fact, any kind of object that you require while working with the programs. And if you're wondering about the group of data that has to be stored, or let's say even individual entities of user data, does it always have to be stored together? The answer is no. When you make use of sessions, there's another advantage where you can store all of these separately in case if that kind of a localization is required for that programming aspect as well. Session, when we talk about the security, is very secure, and the objects get stored on the runtime server, just adding to the very important aspect of data security and data access protocols as well. So these found to be some of the very well-known advantages of making use of a session. Now, coming to the 20th question, your interviewer might ask you if it is possible to manually set a timeout for a session in .NET. So, can you set a timeout manually wherein, let's say you want to end a session whenever you want it? Is it possible? Yes. The answer is yes, because it is actually possible to manually set a session's out time. And how can this be done in the easiest way possible? Well, there is one file called as the web.config file where you can edit a certain parameter where you can manually set the sessions out time as well. So it is as simple as that. So when asked this question, just say yes, it's possible, and then denote about how it's possible and talk about the web.config file as well. With this, we can come to the 21st question that states, what is the meaning of boxing and unboxing in .NET? This is a very interesting question, and I'm sure this is the question that will be 100% asked, in most of the interviews as well, because boxing and unboxing are very, very important concepts. Now, let's talk about boxing. Boxing is actually a process where you can convert a value type into a reference type easily. It's just like taking your value types and putting it into a box and converting it into a reference type without having to perform any large operations or put in a lot of effort as well. And unboxing, as it literally states, is the exact opposite of boxing, where you have all of the reference types that you want to be a value type, right? So converting these reference types back into a value type can be done very effectively when we talk about the concept of unboxing as well. So you can do it directly, you don't have to put much efforts, and there is a direct contradiction and a very, very big difference in terms of boxing and unboxing, as they're literally the mirror images, the opposites of each other. Now with this, we can come to the 22nd question that states, what is the use of a manifest in the .NET framework? We checked out assembly, we checked out the components, we checked out so many things about .NET, and manifest is again a very important thing, because manifest, as I just discussed before, actually stores all of the metadata, all of the data that describes the actual assembly. Metadata is of various types as well. So all of the metadata that's required, there's a lot of things where metadata is required. And if you're wondering what kind of data is stored here, we have the assembly version information, you have security identification protocols, then you have the scope checking of the assembly to see if all in a check, then you have reference validations to all of the classes to make sure that there's no errors there, or any throw off warnings as well. So manifest will contain a lot of details about the assembly, and the details are the 4 very important points as shown on your screen. So make sure to mention all of these in a clear and a concise way to the interviewer. Now with this, we can come to the 23rd question that says, what are memory mapped files used for in .NET? There are entities called as memory mapped files, and there is one very important use of it. It is to make sure that it can instantiate all the contents of a logical file and then convert this into the address of the application. So when we talk about memory mapped files in .NET, they used to instantiate the contents of a logical file and convert it into the address of the application. So this is a very important thing done to make sure to actually help the user, where you can run multiple processes simultaneously and you do not need multiple machines to do it. You can have a single machine to work with a lot of data, to share the data between all of these processes and work with it easily as well. We have one very important function that we have to talk about, is the create from files function. This is actually used to obtain the memory mapped file object very, very easily. So you do not have to type in say 50 or 100 lines of code to actually obtain the memory mapped file object. With this particular function, it is as simple as 2 or 3 lines of code, and you can be done with that. Well, moving on to the 24th question. So there's another short form for you guys this time. It's CAS or CAS. So what is the meaning of CAS in .NET? CAS actually stands for Code Access Security. And again, as the name suggests, it is extremely important entity that is present to make sure that there is no unauthorized access to your code, unauthorized access to your programs or resources in the runtime. So giving limited access to certain points of certain aspects of code is very, very important, because if it can do with limited access, then it's good enough. Why do you have to provide all the access to all of the data, right? It is not only a security aspect. Even when you talk about performance and efficiency, this plays to be a very important role as well. But then CAS is part of the native .NET security architecture. So when you talk about security and when you prefer this, CAS takes the center stage, guys. So with this, we can check out the 25th question that states, what is the meaning of garbage collection? Garbage collection, as the name suggests, is probably you collecting something which is not required anymore, right? Well, it is exactly that. It is a process where we try to collect a lot of things in the memory that we are no longer using, to make sure we do not have any memory leaks or we do not have any sort of inefficiency. So there's an entity that does garbage collection, and this entity is actually called as the garbage collector. The garbage collector has the ability to allocate memory to variables or objects and then deallocate it whenever it's not required or whenever there is a requirement from the application as well. So the garbage collector keeps checking on the reference of the variables and all of the objects that are used by the application. So whenever let's say there is an object or a variable or a reference which is no longer required and it is not being used anymore, what the garbage garbage collector does is that it actually takes away the memory, and it's also called as so what that actually means is that it is deallocating the memory, freeing it up, and making sure that it is available for the next entity to use. So this is the entire process of garbage collection that happens in the .NET framework. So coming to the 26th question, it states, what is the use of GAC or GAC as we call it in .NET? There's another abbreviation, and this time GAC stands for Global Assembly Cache. It's actually a part of the CLR where we actually take all of the assemblies and we store the assemblies and make sure that these assemblies get shared across all of the applications. That's all there is about GAC. And then, whenever the user decides to make use of it, then there's the GAC util or the GAC util application that can be used to add any file to this particular global assembly cache as well. And again, make sure to talk about the abbreviation, make sure to talk about why it is used, and make sure to talk about how you can add a file into GAC by making use of the GAC util application as well. With this, we can come to the 27th question that states, what are the 3 generations of garbage collection that happen in .NET? Well, there are 3 generations as discussed. There's Gen 0, Gen 1 and Gen 2, or Generation 0, Generation 1 and Generation 2. So Generation 0 is the first round of cleaning that happens where, all the short-lived objects get removed. And then Generation 1 will make sure to check what are the objects that got removed or left behind by Gen 0. And then, whatever object gets moved from there will actually live in the Gen 1 cleaning. And Gen 2 is very similar. All the long-lived objects that are no longer required and then which were moved around by the Generation 1 of garbage collection will be stored here. So all the Gen 0 objects are stored in Gen 1, Gen 1 objects are stored in Gen 2. Well, with this we can come to the 28th question that states, what is MVC? MVC is a very common question. It stands for Model View Controller, and it defines an entire architecture or the architectural model which will govern on how one should build applications in .NET. It is the foundation, it is the scaffolding for creation of all applications, and as the name suggests, it's actually 3 entities. It's not one entity, it's 3 entities. It's model, it's view, and it's controller. So model is to make sure that you store all the data and pull back all the data that you have stored in a database as and when required. The view is to make sure you display all of the contents of the application that you're developing, and the controller is used to make sure that you can handle all of the user interactions that happens. And of course, controllers will be in touch with the model and the view aspect of it as well. So this is a very simple, clear, concise definition of what MVC is. And then you can of course talk about MVC for a really long time, but then as I suggest, make sure you keep it very clear, concise, and to show to the interviewer that you do know the concepts and that you can reproduce it in a very pithy way as well. With this, we come to the 29th question that suggests, what are the types of memories that are supported in the .NET framework? This is a very simple question with a very straightforward answer. There's only 2 types of memories that are present in the .NET framework architecture. It's stack and heap. Whenever we talk about static memory allocation, where the memory is allocated at the start of it and is not changed throughout the running of the application, we make use of stack. And then of course, we make use of heaps wherever there's a requirement for the data in case if the size changes, or what we also called as the dynamic memory allocation requirement. So it's stack and heap. Make sure to mention that stack is used for static memory allocation while heap is used for dynamic memory allocation. With this, we come to the 30th question that states, what is the use of delegation in .NET? So a delegate, works very, very simple and very similar to what the delegation means in real life as well. So whenever, let's say, there's a function pointer of any other programming languages, moving it across to make sure, the function values are all encapsulated, the references are correct, and the references are made in a particular object, right? So all of these need to be taken care of, and this is done by delegation. So what actually happens is that we have a delegate object that can be passed into a program after the creation of the object, and then of course the method which was referenced earlier is right. So that is actually called at this point of time. And custom events can also be created in a class when making use of a delegate is again a very, very important point to mention, because custom events are found to be a very vital part, whenever you're working with programming in .NET as well. Now, moving on to the 31st question, it says, what is the difference between an abstract class and an interface in .NET? As the name suggests, abstract classes are not the complete implementation of a function, right? So it only gives you the partial implementation of functionalities that is done by inheriting other classes. An interface is different because an interface will tell you, or it is actually used to declare the behavior of the implementing class. So it will tell you what that class is supposed to do, what that is not supposed to do, and all of that. And when we talk about abstract classes again for a second, it is make sure it is actually used to declare all the methods, let's say events, fields, properties, and all of these. So the abstract class is actually used to define all of these. But in an interface, you cannot do that because fields cannot be declared whenever you're making use of an interface. And these two form to be the very vital, the basic foundational differences between abstract classes and interfaces in .NET. Moving on to the next question, it states, what is the meaning of auto postback in .NET? Again, a very straightforward question. Auto postback is actually a property in the .NET framework that will make sure that there is a provision to provide automatic postback whenever, let's say, there's an event that gets started in its execution cycle. So postbacks are very, very important. They form to be a very key role in the .NET framework and in its execution, especially whenever there is event handling in the picture and how events are handled after the start of its execution as well. So how can you use auto postback? To use auto postback, there's actually the property, and again a very simple binary flip. All you have to do is set the property to true, and then you can make use of it and make sure that there's automatic postback whenever there is an event that gets started with its execution cycle as well. So it's as simple as this. Now with this, we can check out the 33rd question that states, what are the parameters that control the connection pooling that happens with the behaviors in .NET? There's actually 4 very, very important parameters that have the ability to control connection pooling behaviors in .NET. And there's pooling, there's minimum pool size, there's maximum pool size, and we have something called as the connect timeout or the connection timeout as well. So these 4 parameters have the most control when you talk about handling connection pooling behaviors in .NET. So make sure to mention all of these. And then when we talk about the 34th question, it speaks about the requirements that are needed for connection pooling. So we spoke about connection pooling in the last question as well. To add on to that, this can be a follow-up question. So there's actually 3 main requirements that have to be fulfilled whenever you think about connection pooling. And these 3 requirements, are stately. First of all, the first one is to make sure that there is the presence of an identical connection string on both of the entities that are present for connection. And then the second requirement is to make sure that there's multiple processes with the same connection parameters to make sure that the connection goes on flawlessly. And the third thing is to make sure that there is actually some sort of concurrence when you think about security protocols or settings in between the entities that are connecting. So these 3 requirements will make sure that your connection pooling goes through very smoothly without any obstructions as well. So of course these requirements are not very hardcore, as in that you have to have it, but then having this in the creation of the .NET framework, they've done a very good thing to make sure that this is actually a provision where you can use all of these. And at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is to make sure that the users will not have to bear the brunt of let's say if there's any errors or warnings or any mismatches in the protocols or the settings as well. So to avoid all of that, these requirements are put in place. Coming to the 35th question, it states, how many elements can a tuple hold in .NET? Well, there's a maximum of up to 8 elements that a tuple can actually hold in .NET. If you're wondering about what happens if there is more than 8 elements, well, if there's more than 8 elements at a time, each of these extra elements get defined into separate tuples. So there's another separate tuples which will contain another 8 elements and so on. So what are the advantage of making use of tuples in .NET is that so that they can actually be used as parameters, or let's say even return type specifiers whenever it's required as well. So tuples are a very, very vital part of the .NET framework, as you can tell. Now with this, we can check out the 36th question that states, what's the difference between user control and custom control in .NET? So whenever you talk about control in .NET, it's very vital that you understand the subtle differences that lie in between user control and custom control. With user control, the layout is static and it does not change. With custom control, it is dynamic. And with user control, you will have no support if you have to make use of the toolbox, but then custom control will provide you all of the support to make use of the toolbox. So when you talk about user controlled, the control access is actually very tightly coupled, and there is no amount or there's no place for any play there. But then when you talk about custom control, it's loosely coupled control access methodologies and protocols here. And if we talk about the origin, well, user control actually branches out from the same name, while custom control actually branches out from what we call as the control group. So these four are very simple, subtle differences that lie in between user control and custom control in the .NET framework. Now, coming to the 37th question, it states, what is the meaning of role-based security in .NET? Role-based security, again, when you think about the name, is actually an entity that is put into place to make sure that there is security access that's provided based on the roles that the user or the programmer actually provides. So you have to provide certain security access to certain data, certain applications, certain usages, abilities to build and deploy as well. So all of these is done by making use of role-based security. Let's say there's guests in your framework that have to make use of something, or let's say there's administrators, there's users, there's programmers, there's testers, and there can be so many people. So you can actually set the security based on these roles, and that's all about role-based security. And now coming to the 38th question that states, can themes be applied to ASP.NET applications? Can you theme them manually? In fact, would be a better way to state the question, and the answer is yes. A lot of themes can be applied to the ASP.NET applications, and again we come back to the same file, which is the web.config file that you have to play around with to add the themes. There's a small snippet of code that's given in your screen. We have to talk about the configuration, the system.web, and you can see the third line which states pages theme equal to Windows. So this is where you actually change the theme of your .NET application. All you have to do is edit the part that's given in the double quotes, and that will easily change the theme of the application at hand. With this, we can come to the next question that states, what are some of the templates that are present in the repeater control? Again, this is a question which there are a lot of ways you can answer it, but then the most commonly used templates that are present in repeater control are these. You have the alternating item templates, you have the item templates, you have header template, footer template, and of course the separator template as well. So when you're asked to mention these templates, make sure to mention at least 3. But then I would recommend you would mention, at least 5 that are present in the repeater control as well. Again, this is a very straightforward question asking you to state it. So you can state all these templates. And of course, if you do know more templates, then you're very welcome to add on to this as well. Now, coming to the 40th question, it states, what is the status of a data reader that gets checked in .NET? The ability of having to check this is a very big advantage in .NET, because the status of the data reader can be checked without much effort, because there's a property which is called as is closed. So with this property, you can find out if your data reader is open, if it's actually actively reading data, or if it's not reading data. If it is reading data, then it's going to be open. If it's not reading data, then it is going to be closed. So if it's closed, there's going to be a true value which gets returned, because the property we're talking about is closed, right? So if it's closed, if the answer is yes, then the value true is returned, and if the reader is actually open, it will return a value which is called as false, because again, if it's open, it's not closed, right? We're checking is closed. So this is again a very, very simple question, but then this is a question that is asked a lot in the .NET interviews. So make sure to get this one right. Now, moving on to the 41st question. So the 41st question states, what do you mean by cross-page posting? To answer this question, let me talk about a scenario. So let's say there's a situation where you have to press the submit button on any sort of web page, right? So what happens here is that the data is actually stored on the same page. But then if the data has to be stored on a different page, but it has to be linked to the current button or the current page, then this concept is what we call as cross-page posting. It's as simple as that. In fact, there's one property that is called as the PostBack URL that you can make use of to achieve this cross-page posting, where you can have the data for that to be stored on a different page while linking it to the present one as well. It's as simple as this. Now, moving on to the 42nd question that states, what is the use of MIME in .NET? MIME is again another abbreviation that stands for Multi-Purpose Internet Mail Extensions. So it is actually an add-on to the already existing email protocols, which will provide you the ability to easily exchange files over emails. So, whenever there is a web transmission that's happening, then servers will have the ability to actually add on something what we call as the MIME header to the beginning to denote that particular web transmission is actually a MIME transaction. Again, this is happening in the backend, but then you can also manually attach that header as well. So what happens is that all of these email protocols are to be handled, files are supposed to be exchanged over emails, and MIME is one particular add-on that helps with all of this. Moving on to the 43rd question that states, what are the types of cookies that are available in ASP.NET? There's actually two very important types of cookies that you have to discuss about. One is called as the session cookie and the other one is the persistent cookies. Session cookies are actually present on the client machine and they are only valid for one particular session, as the name suggests. So session cookie valid for one session present on the client machine. When we talk about persistent cookies, well, persistent cookies are actually present on the user's machine and it has one particular period that denotes its expiry. So let's say there's a cookie that can be active for, let's say, 2 hours, and then after 2 hours, after the period has ended, the cookies get its expiry. So either depending on the ending of the session or a custom time, you can actually choose to work with either session cookies or persistent cookies. Well, coming on to the 44th question, it states, what are some of the security controls that are present in ASP.NET? There are many security controls, but here are the 5 controls that are very important. See, we have password recovery, we have login, login name, login status, and login view. Password recovery, as the name suggests, is used to send an email to the user whenever, let's say, you have to perform a password recovery operation. Let's say you've lost your password and you have to recover it again. Login will make sure that all the login controls are provided. There's the ID field, the password field, and all the credentials that's required to make a login operation. And then you have the login name. This security control will make sure to display the name of the user who logged in. And then there's the login status. It's actually to donate the authentication flag of that particular user who has logged in. Then you have login view. Login view discusses about all of the varieties of views that are actually provided to the user after the login based on the themes that are active in that current ASP.NET framework as well. So when you talk about the security controls that are present in ASP.NET, make sure to mention all of these. Of course, you do not have to pick each and every one of them and explain them, but then of course it'll add a lot of value if you mention what they are and what they do at the same time. With this, we can come to the 45th question that states, what is the order of events that take place in a page life cycle? Well, since it's an ordered event, you have to think about it in a particular order from its initialization to its rendering. We begin with the operation of pre-initialization, then there's initialization, thirdly we come with initialization complete, then there's the preload operation, the data gets loaded, loading gets complete, pre-rendering operations take place, and at the last, rendering operations takes place. So take a moment to pause the video at this point of time to check out the order. We have pre-init, init complete, preload, load complete. We have pre-render and render. At the end of the day, render complete itself will become the order, so no need to mention that specifically as well. So these are the 8 events that take place in the order for a page lifecycle execution as well. So with this, we can move to the 46th question that states, why are you applying for this .NET developer role in the company? Whenever you ask this question, the interviewer is trying to understand why .NET and why you. Because he or she is trying to find out your interests, your goals, or let's say even your career prospects in the field of .NET. What makes you tick? Is it actually .NET? Do you want to build a career in it? Or did you learn .NET, found it interesting? Do you want to wrap a career around it now? Or are you a person who is switching from another programming language? Or things of that sort. So make sure that you provide your reasons of why .NET is right for you and how .NET has been there for you and how you plan to make use of it to your fullest ability for that particular organization that you are interviewing for as well. That is going to be impressive and that should add a lot of value to your candidature as well. Coming to the 47th question, it states, can you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 depending on your proficiency? Guys, this is again a very tricky question here. Again, the first point that I'm going to talk about is honesty. Make sure you honestly rate yourself. Think about it for a moment and give yourself a rating, because if you overrate yourself, then there's a good chance you might be asked extremely complex questions and you might not clear the interviews. But then if you honestly rate yourself, the interviewer will have an understanding of how much you know about the subject, what proficiency you have about handling all of the tasks, or say even solving all of the problems. So one very important thing that I will reiterate on is honesty. Make sure you honestly give out a rating, and based on that, in fact, your entire interview can be based on as well. And this question can be asked at the beginning of an interview too, so that the interviewer can have an idea of how and what questions to ask as well. Coming to the 48th question that suggests, has your college degree helped you with .NET development in any way? Now, this question will be asked to you if you're a fresher, but then if you're an experienced person who's moving on to .NET, well, this question might not be asked. But then it's very important that you know how to answer it in case you're asked as well. So what the interviewer is trying to assess here is making sure that you've done something in your degree with respect to .NET, and in case if you have, then how has it helped you in your practical life after your college education? So if you have ever learned .NET in your degree, make sure to mention that, and do not talk about what you learned, in my opinion, rather talk about how you made use of what you learned. So this way, you'll be actually adding a lot of value to your answer, and that you can denote that, I'm going to use all of this learning when I join your company as well. So this way, the interviewer can be impressed with your ability to answer the questions effectively. Moving on to the 49th question, it states, what skills should a successful .NET developer possess? So there's many skills that a .NET developer should possess, So this is only asked to make sure to check your understanding on the depths of the role that you're applying for. You can mention 4 or 5 very important domains and skills that you're supposed to have. Starting with the ASP.NET MVC architecture, you need to know how that architecture works, and you have to have an understanding of how you can work with data and databases, client-side web development, a little bit about it, and the entirety of .NET Core as well. So these 4, form to be very important skills that you have to have as a .NET developer. At this point of time, if you're wondering what if I do not have all of these skills, well, do not worry. Question number 50 is going to add on to that, because I'm going to explain how. There's a good chance your interviewer can ask you saying, hey, have you had any sort of certification where you've improved your learning or your implementation in the process? With a certification program, of course, it is, as you might have already known by now, it's the thing that will add a lot of value to your knowledge, to your education, and about the skills that you gather, be it in the field of .NET or anywhere else as well. To the interviewer, it'll be showing that you have very good career aspirations, that you're very serious about having .NET as your primary thing. It'll show that you are very much into career advancement as well, because you have the ability to learn something new in case you've started from scratch, and then do something out of it. So learn something new and do something productive out of it. And it'll also show that you're an effective learner, you're a quick learner. At the end of the day, the certification program will give you a lot of knowledge, will give you a lot of projects to work with, and be it a casual enthusiastic learner or someone who's very serious to build a career upon it, you can have it both ways. So do not talk about the listing of the certification, say, I did this certification, I did that certification, etc. What you need to talk about is what you learned from that certification, because that is what your interviewer wants to find out, what you actually learned and how it has been helpful to you. Or in fact, you can even talk about how you're planning to use that learning in the firm that you're applying for as well. So this again is a very important question, and in my opinion, you should answer it this way. Well, of course, you have reached the end of the top .NET interview questions. I take this opportunity to wish you all the very best for all the interviews ahead. So make sure to revisit these questions as and when you feel that it's necessary to understand how to approach these questions and how best to answer them. I'll see you on the next one.